Thank you very much, Frank, and let me also start by thanking the British Chamber and Gareth for inviting all of us here today and providing us the opportunity to speak on these very important issues at this conference today. I'm really delighted to be here. I am not Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. I know that all of you were expecting her. I'm maybe second, third, or fourth best, but I can tell you that being here is really an honor to speak on her behalf. And while we miss her here today, I'm also delighted to reunite with my good friend, Ambassador Ellen Loy, who was the Secretary General's Special Representative to Liberia during the period that I served as ambassador there from 2008 and 2012. And it really was a privilege to have worked with Ambassador Loy and to work with President Sirleaf and the people and government of Liberia to develop blueprints for cooperative growth in Liberia in the years following a devastating civil war in this country. I gained a keen passion for Africa over my 35 years in the U.S. Foreign Service. In fact, it's hard for me to believe it's been that long. But 35 years in the Foreign Service and throughout my present tenure at Georgetown University, where I serve as a senior fellow. My love for Liberia goes back to my time as a graduate student doing research in Liberia in the 1970s. So I have a very long history with the country of Liberia. This morning, I'd like to share with you my thoughts about Africa's place on the world stage, some of the challenges facing the continent, some of the successes of the partnership that the United States government has had with Africa, and where I see Africa in the coming years. Specifically, I'd like to discuss how Africa can utilize sustainable development goals to bolster educational opportunities, healthcare, and energy infrastructure for the next generation of Africans. The Africa that I have come to know and believe in is a continent of vast opportunity and vast promise. It's a continent with tremendous natural and human resources and a rapidly expanding middle class. It is the next frontier of global opportunities, and it is a continent that has made remarkable progress over the past decades, despite the many challenges that the continent continues to face. I've seen that progress firsthand over nearly 4 decades of work on the continent. When I first visited Africa in 1978 to do research in Liberia, the continent's population was about 450 million, with 27% living in urban areas. And now in 2017, the population is over 1.2 billion, with 40% living in urban areas. The GDP of sub-Saharan Africa back in 1978 was about $170 billion. Now it's about $1.6 trillion. The percentage of people living on less than $1.25 a day in sub-Saharan Africa has dropped from 56% in 1990 to 41% today, which is still not high enough. When I arrived in Liberia in 1978, I found the continent that suffered from repressive governance, military coups, and violence. That was the norm for many African countries in those days, but now I believe we're seeing a different African continent. We're seeing a different picture on the continent of Africa. Liberia has emerged as a champion of democracy and peace, and in 2005, it elected Ellen Johnson Sirleaf as the continent's first woman ever to be elected president in Africa. And she served 2 terms, ending in a transition, hopefully at the end of the year. And it will be historic for Liberia because it will lead to one sitting president, democratically elected, transferring power to another democratically elected president later in the year. Liberia has never had that in its entire history. In the health arena, life expectancy in Africa was about 47 years in 1978, and now it's 60. The child mortality rate has dropped 52% between 1990 and 2015, and the maternal mortality rate has fallen 49%. In education, sub-Saharan Africa has made greater improvements in access to education than any other region in the world since 1990. The proportion of children enrolled in primary or secondary school has risen 54% over the past 25 years. These are incredible statistics. Given its substantial progress in these critical areas and others, Africa is becoming a global player. The world is sitting up and taking notice of what is happening on this continent. And there has been an explosion of investment and interest in Africa over the last two decades. And I know that's the reason we have so many of you from the private sector in this room today. The truth is, we can't meet today's global challenges without Africa. Africa's success is pivotal to international efforts to end poverty, to fight extremism, and to boost economic growth. Looking ahead, where Africa ends up on the world stage in the next century will depend on how well the continent tackles its own challenges this century. It will also depend on how the international community partners with Africa to promote and to implement the SDGs and to help achieve Africa's promise. So let's take a look at some of the challenges Africa faces. Thank you. And how to address them through the framework of SDGs. In 2014, the African Union adopted the Common Africa Position, the CAP, on the post-2015 development agenda. The CAP stressed the need to learn from Africa's experience with the Millennium Challenge Goals, the Millennium Development Goals, over the previous 15 years. The CAP called for a more inclusive formulation of the agenda and the honoring of international commitments made for its implementation. It also emphasized that the post-2015 development agenda be member state-driven and reflect African priorities and programs. Achieving sustainable, meaningful development remains one of the top priorities of every country on the continent of Africa. African countries have been proactive in incorporating SDGs into the national plans and into its strategies. In addition, the African Union has developed a strategy to assist its member states in reaching their SDG goals through targeted implementation of Agenda 2063. This is the AU's strategic framework for the socio-economic transformation of the continent over the next 50 years. The SDGs are much bigger than any single government, of course. To be truly sustainable, they will require sustained commitments from all sectors, including advocacy, international trade and investment, research and development organization, and also from the next generation of African leaders. So let us look at some of the challenges facing Africa today and how advancement of SDGs can mitigate these challenges. And I'd like to first address the most important stakeholder in this process, and that is Africa's youth. Africa is a young continent. Half of all Africans are under the age of 19. Africa's population is projected to double to 2 billion people by 2050. And this is a double-edged sword. There are great possibilities for a huge population, but there are also some downsides. So how do we ensure that this youthful population contributes to Africa's prosperity and not become a source of conflict? I believe we need to start by creating opportunities for Africa's youth. That means creating jobs. It also means strengthening education systems. It means mentoring and providing opportunities for Africa's youth. In spite of recent progress, there's still significant education gaps, an education deficit in Africa. Countries need to invest more in education, including primary school, and particularly for young girls. Weak education means weak opportunity, and when youth have no opportunity, they are susceptible to extremism, they are susceptible to trafficking, they are susceptible to criminality, and as you all know, They are susceptible to getting on boats, fleeing to Europe across the Mediterranean and across the Sahara Desert, taking their lives into their own hands. Young people in Africa are eager for opportunities for education. I saw this every day when I served as the U.S. ambassador to Liberia, and I think Ellen can also comment on this as well, where we saw young people with very few tools, really passionate about education and passionate about learning. In its commitment to working with African partners to improve education, the United States has launched efforts to improve reading skills for primary school children by also providing support for education programs. We're making a huge push for girls' education, where only 51% of women over the age of 15 are able to read and write. And if women can't read and write, they can't contribute to their country's growth. There's a need to put a greater focus on girls' education to ensure that girls can enroll, and more importantly than enrolling, that they remain in school. Through the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, DREAMS program, we're investing in keeping girls in school in 10 sub-Saharan African countries. And this is part of a package of interventions designed to reduce new HIV infections in adolescent girls and young women by 40%. USAID's education programs have had a huge impact on Africa. In Liberia, for example, schools were closed between August 2014 and February 2015 in an effort to prevent Ebola transmission. USAID facilitated educational access by distributing teaching and learning materials and helped 220,000 children return to school following the outbreak. We have to ensure that African countries prioritize education, and investment is pivotal to this end. African countries need to take a hard look at education budgets. They need to compare their education budgets to their security budgets. And they need to make a determination that education is as important as security, and consider whether giving more money to education should be a priority. Programs that support youth, such as the Young African Leaders Initiative, which was a program that we put together focused on bringing young African leaders to the United States to give them leadership training in programs across U.S. universities, has been quite successful in creating concrete opportunities that will help Africa's future leaders be prepared for leadership. Yale has committed significant resources to propel this next generation of African leaders by ensuring that we bolster their commitment to entrepreneurship and to leadership. We also have created 4 Yale leadership centers in higher education institutions in Ghana, in Kenya, and Senegal, as well as South Africa. And these organizations are helping to train, mentor, and helping young people to network with each other across the continent of Africa. And already we've had about 450 young people who participated in these regional training centers, but we've had close to 3,000 young Africans come to the United States. We currently have 1,000 who are at about 30 universities across the United States who are participating in leadership programs this summer. When I leave here tomorrow, I'll be heading to Madison, Wisconsin, and to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I will be speaking to some of these young people to encourage them and to help them and mentor them as they prepare for their roles as leaders on the continent of Africa in the next generation. Africa's youth are its greatest resource, and they are a force for good. African leaders should view them as a treasure, as a source of dynamism to bring their countries out of poverty and into strong and prosperous nations, and to help build successful governments. If we can ensure Africa's youth are engaged and contributing to their countries, Africa's economies will grow, and we know that their people will prosper. If we look in the healthcare arena, improving education will also improve healthcare outcomes as well, because the two are very much intertwined with each other. We saw the link clearly during the Ebola outbreak, where lack of education about disease transmission led to poor health decisions during the Ebola outbreak. Throughout Africa, many challenges persist in the healthcare arena. Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest rate of maternal and child deaths of any region in the world, and only 32% of sub-Saharan African populations has basic access to power, and this deficit prevents progress in both health as well as education sectors. Therefore, strengthening Africa's healthcare infrastructure and human resources for health is a critical priority as we move to implement the SDGs. PEPFAR has made great strides in combating HIV/AIDS, saving lives of millions of Africans, and bringing an AIDS-free generation within reach on the continent of Africa. Africa has contributed to the significant progress made toward eradicating polio around the world, yet polio reemerged in northern Nigeria in 2016, representing a setback to global polio eradication efforts. A polio-free Africa is in sight, though, and through vigilance and increased resources, I think that we can achieve the goals that we hope to achieve in that area. The Ebola epidemic in Liberia exposed the fragility of the health sector, and it also exposed the fragility of the economy in Liberia that was really set back over the 14-month period in which they were dealing with Ebola. Ebola killed thousands. It drained vitally needed resources, it slowed economic growth, and it delayed key development projects. And one of the hard-learned lessons of the Ebola crisis is that good governance, which includes allocating funds for health, is key to mitigating epidemics like Ebola. The death toll from Ebola in Liberia and neighboring countries was a tragedy in itself, and it thwarted progress on achieving the SDG goals. While the international community responded to the Ebola crisis, we need to translate the effective emergency response to Ebola into an effective long-term healthcare system across the continent of Africa. And we hope to continue to support the establishment of an African Center for Disease Control and Prevention, a so-called Africa CDC, which will reinforce increasingly capable health and science sector in Africa. And we hope that the Africa CDC will serve as a platform for sustainable public health capacity. Efforts like these will build the capacity of local healthcare systems so that they can effectively respond to challenges like Ebola. But this goal is ultimately the responsibility of African countries themselves, of their governments, and of their people. Sustainable, locally financed healthcare system is the best long-term solution to dealing with situations like Ebola. Let me talk a bit about the energy infrastructure. Energy is a major constraint to economic growth and community development on the continent of Africa. The United States is working very closely with African governments, but also partners around the globe to prioritize and address key legal, regulatory, and policy constraints to investments and to implement measures that will sustain growth and enable successful governance of a growing power sector throughout sub-Saharan Africa. I think one good example of a promising initiative comes from Liberia. When I served in Liberia from 2008 to 2012, Liberia started out having provided no electricity for its people. And they put street lights, and Ellen will recall this as well. There were street lights that were put around the city, and you could go around the city anytime during the night, and you would see young people studying under street lights. It could be pouring rain outside, and they would be out there under their street lights trying to make sure that they committed themselves to their educations. And this was an incredible sight. And it occurred to me, if streetlights could encourage students, what would happen in Liberia if there was electricity in schools and electricity in homes and in hospitals, and how much more could be achieved in Liberia if the private sector had access to reliable and affordable energy. The United States, after I left Liberia, but something that I worked on diligently while I was there, signed a $257 million Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact in 2015. The compact seeks to improve road infrastructure and bolster access to reliable, affordable electricity. And we worked with the government of Norway and with the EU and with the UN to rehabilitate the Mount Coffee hydroelectric plant, which is also part of a Power Africa initiative, and it more than doubled the availability of electricity in Liberia. I was back in Liberia in December, where we cut the ribbon on the first turbine of the power plant, and it was an amazing accomplishment that I know will contribute to Liberia's ability to implement their own SDG goals. Energy will continue to be instrumental to Africa's growth and success in the coming years. Finally, I have to say a word about politics in Africa, because politics is everything on this continent, and we know that establishing strong democratic governance and eliminating corruption will also be crucial to advancing SDGs in Africa. And while we've seen progress in some places, too often we have witnessed setbacks. One of those setbacks being South Sudan, where, again, Ellen served as the Secretary General's special representative, a country where we all celebrated their accomplishment in achieving independence in 2011. And 2 years after that, they were embroiled in a horrible civil war, leading to thousands of deaths and many more thousands of people being forced from their homes. Liberia's upcoming presidential and legislative elections will also, as I noted earlier, mark a historic moment in deference to the Constitution and to ordinary Liberian citizens, and with a commitment to peaceful transfer of power. President Sirleaf will step down after her 2 terms in office. The credibility of this important election hinges on the maintenance of peace, which will include the gracious concession of the unsuccessful candidates. We fortunately saw that happen in the case of Nigeria in 2015, and most recently in the case of Ghana in December of this year. But in order for democracy and economic growth to flourish throughout Africa, you need more than peaceful elections as well. We also need to work with African countries to combat corruption that remains rampant across the continent of Africa. And I know that as business people, you know how difficult it is for you to do business in countries where corruption is the order of the day. Corruption actively works against justice. It promotes exclusion and poverty, and it denies the most vulnerable people in Africa their basic needs and their basic rights. And it stifles development and implementation of the SDGs. So we have to work as international partners. We have to work with governments to end corruption by holding people accountable and helping governments to recover stolen funds. When we look at some of the cases and the amount of money that has left the continent of Africa because of corruption, we know that we can change the trajectory of this continent if we dealt with these issues. So finally, let me conclude on a more positive note. I've always tried to be positive about Africa, and I do feel positive. I want to emphasize that I am very optimistic about where I see this continent going in the future. And my optimism comes from a number of areas. It comes from the fact that we do have this dynamic population of African youth who we know have tremendous possibilities. And we know that we have a continent that has great natural resources, both in terms of their people, but also in terms of their youth. And if Africa can effectively harness these resources, I'm confident that we see a bright future for this continent. The SDGs will be instrumental in advancing Africa's goals in terms of education, healthcare, and infrastructure, and they will also create an environment for good governance. And we think that in that environment, countries can flourish. However, implementation of SDGs must be African-led. And I think that's the point that you made when you were reading from the statement earlier, that they must be African, it must be an African-led progress, and it must be for the African people. African leaders, however, cannot do this alone. They need to have, for success, They need to have strong relationships and continued engagement with international partners. And this is a team effort. It's a team effort and that's the reason I think all of us are here today. International partners, whether you are in government, business, media, civil society, will be instrumental in supporting Africa's efforts to implement SDGs. And regardless of whether you are inside government or outside government, every single person in this room has a role to play in ensuring that international partnership with Africa is successful. Africa needs all of our ideas, it needs our passion, it needs our advocacy, and it needs the teamwork that we are all involved in here today. So let me end by thanking again the British Chamber for bringing us all together today to look at how we can successfully move forward on the SDGs on the continent of Africa and see this continent achieve the potential that we all know is there. Thank you.